Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you regarding the United States Supreme Court ruling that permits the President of the United States to not recognize Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. And it is as follows. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down a U.S. congressional attempt to allow Americans born in Jerusalem to list Israel as their birthplace on their passports. The court was considering a 2002 law that instructed the U.S. State Department to record the place of birth as Israel in passports of American children born in Jerusalem if their parents requested that designation. The case, Zivotofsky versus Kerry, was brought by the parents of Menachem Zivotofsky, who was born not long after Congress enacted the law. At the time, U.S. President George Bush said that he would not allow the State Department to honor the request, and President Obama has continued this policy. The law was meant to make a symbolic stand on the political status of Jerusalem. Zivotofsky's attorneys argued that the case was not about formal recognition of Jerusalem, but merely a matter of how an American is identified on his or her passport. The court ultimately disagreed. The vote was 6-3, with the court's three Jewish justices, Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, and Alana Kagan, voting with the majority to not recognize Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. The President, rather than Congress, must determine national policy on the status of Jerusalem, the majority said. Justice Anthony Kennedy, writing for 5 justices, said, "Jerusalem's political standing has long been and remains one of the most sensitive issues in American foreign policy, and indeed it is one of the most delicate issues in current international affairs." Justice Kennedy said that the U.S. Constitution gave the President exclusive authority to determine the nation's stance on these matters. Put simply, he wrote, the nation must have a single policy regarding which governments are legitimate in the eyes of the United States and which are not. The nation must speak with one voice, he said, and that voice must be the President's. Justice Kennedy based his opinion on provisions of the Constitution authorizing the President to receive foreign ambassadors, to appoint American ones, and to make treaties. However, Chief Justice Roberts responded that receiving ambassadors is a presidential duty rather than a power. The President does have power to make treaties and appoint ambassadors, the Chief Justice added, but those authorities are shared with Congress, so they hardly support an interference that the recognition power is exclusive. Furthermore, Chief Justice Roberts said that the majority had taken a bold step. Today's decision is a first, he wrote. Never before has this court accepted a president's direct defiance of an act of Congress in the field of foreign affairs. Furthermore, he said that the decision was based on the mere possibility that observers overseas might misperceive the significance of the birthplace designation on a U.S. passport. Justice Scalia announced his dissent from the bench, saying, "A principle that the nation must have a single foreign policy which elevates efficiency above the text and structure of the U.S. Constitution will systematically favor the President at the expense of Congress," he said, "but it is certain that, in the long run, it will erode the structure of equal and separated powers that the people established for the protection of their own liberty." Justice Kennedy wrote that some observers had interpreted passport provisions as altering United States policy, leading to protests across the Middle East. Chief Justice Roberts responded that giving legal weight to such mistaken reactions is essentially to subject a duly enacted statute to an international heckler's veto. Justice Kennedy wrote that Congress was not free to contradict the President's determination about the status of Jerusalem, even in a notation in a passport. This is not to say Congress may not express its disagreement with the President in myriad ways, Justice Kennedy added. For example, it may enact an embargo, decline to confirm an ambassador, or even declare a war, but none of these acts would alter the President's recognition decision. Ari and Naomi Zivotofsky, the parents of their son Menachem, spent 12 years fighting for their son to be listed as a citizen of Jerusalem, Israel, on his passport instead of merely Jerusalem, said, "We expected the courts in the United States to be about more than politics. Perhaps the result shows that this assumption is not correct, but we thought that the legal system in the United States is unrelated to the political system there. A passport is just a symbol of the central problem here, which is very large, due to the United States not recognizing the sovereignty of the State of Israel over any part of Jerusalem. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest said, "We welcome the Supreme Court's important decision in Zivotofsky versus Kerry, which reaffirms the long-established authority of the President of the United States to recognize foreign states, their governments, and their territorial boundaries. The court's decision upholds the President's long-standing authority to make these sensitive recognition determinations as part of his conduct of diplomacy and foreign policy." Presenting its case, the Obama administration argued that recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital would compromise the United States' position as an objective arbiter in peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians. The decision, Earnest concluded, confirms that the President's recognition determinations should be accurately reflected in official documents and sensitive diplomatic communications, including passports. Historically, Jerusalem has been divided into East and West, following Israel's War of Independence in 1948 and 49 that broke out after Israel was declared a nation on May the 14th, 1948. Israel has controlled the entire city of Jerusalem following the June 1967 Six-Day War, and eventually annexed the eastern part of Jerusalem in 1980, combining it with the western part of the city to be Israel's capital, in a move unrecognized by either the United States or the United Nations. As a result, Jerusalem's status remains one of the sticking points in final status negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. A peace process that seeks to reconcile the seemingly irreconcilable reality of Israel attempting to find a compromise solution in the conflict, and the Palestinians who refuse to recognize Israel's existence and or yearns for its annihilation. Palestinian chief negotiator in the peace process, Saeb Erekat, praised the U.S. Supreme Court decision and said it sends a clear message to the Israeli government that Jerusalem is an occupied territory. Erekat added that the U.S. Supreme Court's decision highlighted that the Israeli decision to annex East Jerusalem in 1980 is a total violation of international law. Nabil Abu Radena, spokesman for Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, hailed the important decision that he says runs in accordance with UN Security Council resolutions. "This is a clear message that Israel occupies East Jerusalem as well as the West Bank and Gaza Strip," he said. However, Jerusalem Mayor Nir Barkat called for U.S. President Barack Obama to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, saying that it was particularly important when anti-Semitism is trying to raise its ugly head. Just as Washington is the capital of the United States, London the capital of England, and Paris the capital of France, so Jerusalem was and always will be the capital of Israel and the heart and soul of the Jewish people. Nitzana Darshan Leitner, head of lawfare NGO Sharat Hadin, said besides the specific issue just decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, their decision involves a greater issue regarding who decides things when it comes to U.S. foreign affairs, Congress or the U.S. State Department. This question could come up in other matters such as American financing for the Palestinian Authority. Congress decided to limit the transfer of funds to the Palestinian Authority from the State Department so that it may only be transferred if there is certainty that it will not go toward terrorism. The State Department, however, has been ignoring Congress, and when the matter reaches the courts, there will again be a debate over who decides foreign policy, Congress or the U.S. State Department. As for the court's decision itself, Darshan Leitner said that it truly damages every single Israeli person. This is a disappointment. While it is true that this is a decision that relates to the internal affairs of the United States, in which delimits the boundaries of the executive branch's discretion and who decides foreign policy, one cannot ignore the actual decision itself, which de facto does not recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and this is a real kick in the face of every Israeli citizen. Furthermore, a significant consequence of this U.S. Supreme Court decision may occur when the United Nations General Assembly opens its next session on September the 15th. There's been indications that France plans to submit to the UN Security Council a resolution to prescribe a Palestinian state in the disputed territories of the West Bank with East Jerusalem as its capital, with a negotiating deadline of 18 months. The U.S. may support this proposed resolution, or it may allow it to pass with a U.S. abstention. If this happens, it would contradict one of the arguments made by the Obama administration during this U.S. Supreme Court case, when they insisted recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel would critically compromise the ability of the United States to work with Israelis, Palestinians, and others in the region to further the peace process. In addition, it would now be very hypocritical for the Obama administration to turn around after the arguments they made in this U.S. Supreme Court case to violate it and support a United Nations resolution specifying a Palestinian state, which includes East Jerusalem as its capital, as a dictate rather than the ultimate outcome of Jerusalem being decided in negotiations between the parties themselves. In addition, a long list of major American Jewish organizations expressed dismay at the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that American citizens born in Jerusalem may only list their birthplace as Jerusalem rather than Jerusalem, Israel. The Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, an umbrella group representing 51 organizations, issued a statement saying that the organization's leaders were deeply concerned by the ruling. We do not believe that Jerusalem-born American citizens having Israel on their passport would impinge on future peace negotiations or compromise the role of the United States in this area, argued Chairman Stephen Greenberg. Tens of thousands of Americans are affected by this decision. Abraham Foxman, the national director of the Anti-Defamation League, described the U.S. government's approach regarding Jerusalem as hypocritical. The Anti-Defamation League has spearheaded an effort signed by 12 Jewish organizations which argued that Americans born in Jerusalem should be able to identify their country of birth on their passport in the same way other American citizens born abroad may do. The question for the Supreme Court in this case involved a simple and ministerial act: whether or not U.S. citizens born in Jerusalem should be allowed to list their birthplace as Israel, Foxman wrote after the U.S. Supreme Court ruling. The answer to that should have been an easy yes, and the court did not have to issue a sweeping decision about executive power to reach that conclusion. Foxman called on the administration to step up, asking how long would the U.S. government continue to behave in this hypocritical way. It is sad and unfortunate that Israel, as a sovereign nation, is the only country in the world whose capital comes under such scrutiny and has to defend its right to determine where its capital city exists, Foxman continued. It's time for the executive branch to face the reality. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, he concluded. Similar expressions of disappointment came from across the Jewish religious spectrum. Rabbi Jonah Pesner, director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, said that his organization was disappointed by the decision, which he described as circumscribing the right of Americans born in Jerusalem to lawfully and accurately identify their birthplace as Israel. The Religious Action Center was one of the organizations that signed on to the Anti-Defamation League brief, and Pesner noted that the reform movement has long called for U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and that Israel should not be subjected to legal disadvantages under U.S. law that are not applied to other nations. Jerusalem is unquestionably the capital of Israel. Well, that's going to conclude this week's report, where we shared with you regarding the importance and significance of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that will now permit the President of the United States, if he so chooses, to not recognize that Jerusalem is the sole and exclusive capital of the nation of Israel. Until we do it again, Shalom, and Yeshua the Messiah, Amen.